should probably explain myself, about why I'm here, because I think there is something about my journey which makes what I say particularly personal and relevant to me, and hopefully will help position what I want to talk to you about. So I'm an activist theologian largely because I get cross about things and I want to kind of crack on and change the world. And we've heard quite a lot this morning about the structure being broken, the system being broken, and it feeling very difficult to influence capitalism or work or organisations or whatever. And I too have felt that. My very first job was working for Church Commissioners for England back in the day when they just lost 800 million quid on the stock market and were in a state of disarray before they got reorganised by Turnbull. When with my theology degree in hand, didn't feel massively competent about helping with that. So I buzzed off to get an MBA at Edinburgh. And went off to Deloitte to sort out banks and things, which clearly went extremely well. And then I was a lot about industry. And then I went off to Ashridge, largely a big business school in Hertfordshire that teaches leadership, amongst other things. But largely because I had a bee in my bonnet about spirituality and management, and I wasn't getting very much traction. We'd set up something called the Foundation for Workplace Spirituality to try and get a narrative that would be attractive to the secular as well as the sacred. And I think we were probably just a bit before our time. And it occurred to me that whenever I talked to people about ethics in the boardroom or corporate social responsibility or spirituality, people would all say, yes, but there's all these nasty, ghastly, narcissistic boss types, and without them changing, we can't possibly do anything. So I thought, well, bollocks to that, I'm going to sort that out. So the first book that I wrote about this, I wrote some other books about theology in the church and ethics and things, was this one last year, called Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions. And those of you who've been complaining this morning about things like shareholder value and organisational structures will be delighted to know that they are some of the assumptions that are addressed in this book. Because we have become victims of some fairly flat earth thinking about the way the world ought to be, and imagine that that is not susceptible to change. But what we know about complex adaptive systems, such as society and economics, is that it just takes consistent nudges from people over time to change the entire dynamic. So that is the first bit, which is about the macro. The book that's coming out next year, which I've just finished writing, is one of the reasons I'm here. It's called Leadersmithing, and it's saying, well, it's all very well to sort out the system, but we also need to make sure that leaders within that system feel really courageous and confident about changing that system. Do come in and grab a seat so you don't need to loiter by the door. So this morning we heard a lot about why is it that it is so hard to get that transfer that Karen talked about, apart from just in your little team, back into organisations at large, when you've had one of these crucible moments, when you have gone off and had a transformation, or you just are a person of good faith. And I think what I have learned from working with thousands of leaders over the last 10, 15 years that I've been teaching them at Ashridge, is that the things that actually stop us being ethical aren't because we're bad people. It's often because we don't notice we ought to be being ethical, because we're a bit tired and exhausted and just doing kind of knee-jerk reactions, or we don't have the courage to be ethical. So one of the things I've been setting about doing recently is trying to figure out precisely how you tool people up to be better leaders. So I want to talk to you about that because I think that talks into the narrative about character, which is where I want to start. So confession time. Have any of you been involved with small children, upbringing thereof, behind their own parents or grandparents? And have any of you ever had recourse to a sticker chart? Well, I didn't realise this was a thing, but I was pregnant and trying to learn about, what being a mum is all about. So I went to visit lots of family and friends, and in every single kitchen, in every single room in the country that I went to, there was one of these wretched things on the fridge. And whether it was potty training, whether it was eating your peas, whatever it was, the way we get children to do things these days is through sticker charts. And this led to my godson, when everyone else had fled, because he was taking so long to eat his dinner, sitting there and fixing me with his beady eyes, saying, if I eat my peas, do I get a sticker? And it occurred to me that that's exactly the conversation I have with a lot of senior people in business, which is entirely about stock options, executive remuneration, all these things. It is all about this issue of extrinsic reward that we talked about earlier when we talked particularly about McIntyre and the idea of having intrinsic rewards in practices that are to do with being professional and excellent. And so when I wrote this book and was picking my toxic assumptions, one of them I picked was this idea of utility and utilitarianism. Because of course, as a narrative, an ethical narrative, it came into ascendancy just when Adam Smith and Co, Ricardo and gang, were starting to set out a blueprint for capitalism. And what a convenient ethical narrative, because you can demonstrate to everyone that you're being scrupulously fair. It's not particularly loaded with religion, so if you're one of these new states like America or France, it's a pretty good narrative to have because it's not loaded with deontological assumptions about gods or God or weird stuff. And you can keep saying, well, you know, we are in our public purse mode, trying to be greatest good for the greatest number, and that is manifestly fair. So of course it means that capitalism is now entirely dependent on this one ethical narrative, which we know is just one narrative. We particularly know it if we're Christians, because it's not actually our narrative. We have bits of it that we use, but actually we have much more of a deontological narrative. So it's interesting that sort of snuck in, because it means now everything is about business case, and you can kind of do anything if the business case stacks up, which does mean basically we're all for sale. So that leaves us in a really vulnerable position, because it means when we're developing leaders, particularly in business schools, we're developing a particular skill set which is about very cunning guessing of the future, weighing up pros and cons and managing risk, which is a brilliant skill set, but it's not necessarily a moral skill set. So when I first studied ethics on my MBA at Edinburgh, they had made it compulsory, which was a good start, but the only way they taught ethics was by doling out a case study about naughty corporation A or naughty corporation B, and we'd all sit there and discuss it very earnestly and say, well, clearly they were frightfully naughty, and if we'd been in charge, we would have done C. And you actually think, well, fine, what is that teaching us? It's teaching us as a group that we can pretend to be a chief exec and pretend to have some issues which we can pretend to solve and feel like we've resolved it. And actually, when I was teaching ethics at Ashridge, I was extremely unpopular because the first thing I did was ask them if they could prove to me they existed. So they spent quite a lot of time trying to do that. And then I'd send them off for a walk to talk about their value system. And we had a whole load of lenses, whether it was your value system about existential reality, whether it was about politics, whether it was economics, whether it was about psychology, the point of the person. They had to go through all of these worldviews in order to be able to articulate what they thought their core belief system was, whatever that was. And then we let them discuss some ethical issues. And when they got halfway through, we'd swap sides, which they weren't expecting, so they had to figure out if they still believed the same on the other side. So you've got a very confused set of people at the end of it who are very angry because they thought that the point of business is business. So actually ethics isn't relevant because as long as you're serving the shareholder, that's all you should be learning on an MBA. So we've come a long way since then because we know that that narrative doesn't really work. That whenever you have very clear business cases for things like snooping onto everybody's emails and stuff, there is an outcry because it doesn't feel right. Because we are all basically very morally aware people, and actually that very casuistic, calculatory ethic makes sense intellectually, but it doesn't always make sense of the heart. So I'm interested in, given that we know that that isn't sufficient, and given that deontology is contested because there are whose rules are you going to use, what is it that we do need to just rediscover about virtue ethics particularly? And obviously after virtue ushered in a new discussion in the 80s about what Aristotelian virtue looks like, which is now being talked about in a corporate context. Difficult problem to solve because you can spend a lot of time chatting to McIntyre about practices, but what does that really mean? And how would you train that? So I want to sort of take a sidestep and talk to you about a journey I then had about leadership development, which I think supplies the answer. And this, I think, will ring bells for some of you who have had leadership positions because it was a very practical way of trying to solve the problem about what is leadership. So I was a fairly junior person at Ashridge. I was one of the first girls they'd hired in to teach people about leadership, which is a bit tricky because mainly I was teaching blokes who were a bit older than me. And one of the kind of senior guru types thought it'd be nice to get the young ones to devise a junior leadership course because, you know, in those days, as we've heard this morning, there was this idea you did management courses until you got senior and then, hey, you became a leader, yay! And it was as though it was entirely sort of seniority. And of course we know that leadership can be a function of wherever you are in whatever organisation, but there was an organisational logic, which is leadership was a bit like being a strategic director or something. It kind of allowed you to get more stock options or a better office or something. So we got curious about what is the difference between leadership and management at all levels, not just at a senior level. And we got a bit bogged down in those sort of lists you have to do on courses about, you know, leaders are all visionary and managers do as they're told, and, you know, rule makers and rule takers and all that stuff that you get on courses. And we're just getting fed back to us from all these very diligent students exactly what we talk about and nothing very interesting. So we decided that what we would do is we'd go to a whole load of actually senior leaders at board level and say to them, well, okay, if we're talking about how do we prepare leaders to become you, let's say maybe 10-year period, what do you know now as a leader that you wish you'd known 10 years ago? And we just kept asking that question of loads and loads of leaders. We did a whole load of original research about it, and then whenever we tailored what I'll talk about in the simulation, we went to another set of leaders in that particular organisation, that particular industry, to say, well, what are the things you know now as a leader that you wish you'd known 10 years ago? And what we noticed, there was a very spooky similarity about the things they said. The one thing they said unprompted, all of them, was, I wish I'd known more about myself. And again, that rings true with all the literature on emotional intelligence, all the literature on hubris, all the literature on mistakes and all these kinds of things. But more than that, when we probed and said, well, how did you learn these things? Because what we were trying to do, obviously, is get some 2020 foresight we could inject into the bottoms of all these future leaders so they'd be job ready now, and then we could all go home and stop wasting time. And what they came up with was this list that Karen will have some resonance with because of her crucible experiences of what we've called critical incidents. And this was 17 things that consistently we were told over a 10-year period, because we were researching it for a long time, were the particularly pivotal things that every leader had to be able to evidence that they could do well in order for them to feel that they were performing well. And it's interesting reflecting on the conversations we had this morning, because a lot of them have resonance with some of the things we've been talking about. So you'll see loud and proud up there, difficult conversations. So there's something about dealing with poor performance here, and lots of things about delegating to and empowering staff. And one of the things that I noticed was that an awful lot of leaders were being prevented from leading well because they were very fearful of that difficult conversation. And actually in the research, the thing they were most afraid of was either a man shouting or a woman crying. Those were the particular things they were trying to avoid in not having a difficult conversation. And so we thought, well, how do you teach this to people? Well, you teach it to them by making them do it, and making them do it a lot. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the brain science behind this, and how we got detailed about that, and then what I think this has to say to us thinking about the development of character. So let me just talk about the brain. Those of you who've been in the leadership development space for a while will know it's all been very cerebral. This is for lots of very good reasons, because a lot of the types who like to research leadership and be top leaders are very cerebral people. And we've got very good at figuring out all the names and all the titles, bits of the brain, we all get very scientific about it. The problem about a lot of leadership development, though, is it's rather assumed that when you're being a leader, you're sitting relaxed in your fabulous office with millions trotting around, and you can be entirely scientific about your decision. And so you can think, I've read a Harvard Business Review article about that, and I'm sure Ashridge had a brilliant theory I could apply. The problem is most leadership happens when everything has gone seriously tits up, and everyone is staring at you going, right, sort it out! And you're supposed as the great leader to go, aha, clearly the answer is 42. And everyone goes, oh, all is 42, I'm a total winner. The problem is that's not what leadership actually feels like to people who are in that job. It feels to them like constantly feeling in a state of panic, having to just figure out what to do. So you'll have heard of imposter syndrome. I haven't yet met a senior leader who doesn't suffer from it, which is probably a good sign, because actually if you think you're brilliant in that role, you're probably about to fail fairly badly. But it does mean you've got an awful lot of people who are masking the fact that they have a really low amount of confidence. What they're trying to do is just keep doing the right thing day in, day out. That's not really about leadership. That is about what I would call leader smithing. It's about the day-to-day craft and practice of just trying to be a really good leader. So if we're only populating the kind of neocortex bit of your brain, we're not resourcing you to deal with all the various things that could happen to you. So if this is the sort of walnut, and this is the almond, so those of you who know your neurobiology will know that the amygdala in your brain, named after the almond, is the bit that we've kept from being reptiles, which is the particular bit that comes into ascendancy when you are in peril. So it is just at the sort of base of your spine in the middle of the back. And what happens is if something happens to you, a kind of, it used to be a Polaroid, I guess, these days it would just be a sort of click on your phone, isn't it? A sort of a visual of that gets fed into your head in order to drive out a reaction, an appropriate reaction. And what's happened because of the way our brains have evolved is that message gets sent to two different filing stations, if you like. One is Mr. Oxbridge, who's frightfully brilliant at his Latin, can call the cerebellum and all these kinds of things. He's really brilliant at filing, he's got a PhD in it. So everything that ever happens to you ever gets put into his filing cabinets, and then generally speaking, if there's an issue, he will go up to his filing cabinets, figure out what the template is, pull it out and say, this is what you do now. And normally that's fine. The problem is that the bit of our brain, this almond bit, the amygdala, which is the bit we kept from when we were reptiles, is a bit like your kind of worst nightmare, dodgy teenager who can't really be arsed with filing. So they get sent a lot of stuff, and they just chuck it in the bin, really. So if you're actually going to compare the filing systems of the two, you've got Dr. Oxbridge with his degrees in filing, and then you've got Stroppy Teenager, who can't be asked. So if you have a look at their photograph album, they've got some quite key moments from when they were young. So they're looking a bit sepia and sort of 80s hair and all that by now. But things peter out because, you know, the first time you ever got shouted at by your mum or your ghastly baby sister came home for the first time, you realise it was game over, or your first birthday party or first horse or whatever, I don't know. Those things are quite kind of high octane. But then when you had your 20th horse and your 50th snog, it's not news, is it? So you chuck it in the bin. So the problem with that is it means that in our heads we've got two filing cabinets, one is brilliant, one is not. So what you really want is Dr. Oxbridge to be in charge when you're in peril, because he can actually give you the data you need to survive. The problem is that there is an override biologically because of this need to survive as a species, which means that your almond, your amygdala, takes over when your body tells it to, because your body says it's stressed. And then you've got to hope that the templates in your amygdala are good enough. So here's an example of this, which taught me quite a lot about how we start building different behaviours into people's brains. I told you I was a Deloitte consultant. I was brilliant, by the way. I had MBA Student of the Year, and I had a mobile phone in the days they were quite large. I had a pinstripe suit, I had cufflinks, laptop. I was phenomenal, I was amazing. So I was in this office in Mayfair, being phenomenal and amazing. And we'd been organising this event for this company, Marconi, you may remember, another great accolade in my career. They had decided that their new chief exec, they got a guy from the city to sort them out, turn them into a telecoms, finance play. He'd wanted just to announce everything to the city, and he'd been told that probably he should announce it to his board before he told the city. That might just be polite. So they arranged, ironically enough, at Runnymede, an event for him to talk to the board about his vision. And an email about this had gone out from us, and it had an error in it. Instead of Thursday the 28th, it had Friday the 28th of November. So he read this and went absolutely ballistic. So he phoned up the global head of Deloitte to complain about this awful thing. And he was clearly quite hopping mad, but the guy was in America on a different time zone, so he wasn't picking up. This did not improve his temper. So he then decided to phone the UK head of Deloitte to complain about this oversight. And he was on voicemail too, so that didn't improve his temper. He then got to the audit partner to talk to him, who was on voicemail, so that did not improve his temper. Then he saw my mobile phone number. So he phoned me. I was standing in the office, being fabulous, and I go, "Hello, Deloitte Consulting," with my enormous mobile phone. And all I hear down the phone is vitriol, swearing and shouting and all this stuff. And I just noticed that all I want to do is pee. So I'm standing there in the office. I have to sort of pass the phone to somebody else and leg it down the corridor. And I think, well, hang on, Poole, that's not a career-enhancing manoeuvre. And let's try to figure out why that happened and how we avoid that happening again. So when I did my metaphorical going under my teenager's bed to try and find out what my amygdala had been up to, what I found was a template from probably when I was about 3, when a piece of family china had been smashed by a falling jam jar, and clearly it was my fault. And my dad had come out to the garden and started absolutely laying into me about, ancestral china. And of course, when you're 3, what is a really top strategy? Because if you wet yourself, go, I'll get your mother, and he leaves you alone. So, great strategy if you're 3, terrible strategy if you're 30. So that taught me something quite important, which is that because I was a nice, well brought up little Fife girl, I wasn't supposed to pick fights with chaps, I was supposed to just be a very nice girl. And so actually, I didn't have any men shouting at me, pretty much, between my dad shouting when I was 3 and this guy shouting when I was 30. So I then decided I had to have a little experiment, which was my picking fights with chaps experiment. So over the next few months, I had to set about, in meetings, that thing you do in meetings where someone says something that's clearly odious, and you kind of sit there and go, ha! And you just sort of think, what an idiot, but I wasn't saying anything. And so I've been doing that for years, clearly, which meant that I wasn't playing an active role in discussions or manning up or doing anything sensible. I was doing total worse. And I thought what I need to start doing is actually at least writing it down in a kind of passive-aggressive way or frowning or something, and then gradually getting to, can you repeat that? Or something, in order to try and just ramp up my ability to deal with men shouting at me. And I have to report, glad day, about a year later, I was in the Berkhamsted Chinese takeaway car park, and a colleague of mine from Ashridge phoned up and started ranting down the phone. And I was standing there, feeling fine, listening to him, ranting away. And I had this little coach in my head saying, don't worry, Eve, just let him shout about it, and then you've got to say sorry, and you've got to... And it was brilliant. So it had only taken me a year to figure out that if you have better templates, you will have more options. So I want to explain why this is important and why it really helps thinking very particularly about leadership and character. So my first bit of evidence is who has daughters or nieces who like the Princess Diaries? Princess Diaries. A lot of wisdom in these things. Right, Princess Diary moment. Okay. So she's having a bit of a nightmare because she's trying to decide whether she really wants to be the Crown Princess. You've got to imagine it. She's in San Francisco. She's just discovered that her father, before he died, tragically, wrote her a letter. And she reads the letter in the rain in San Francisco. And in this letter, her dead father is talking to her about life and how important it is. And a very important point in this letter, he says, the one thing you must remember is there are some things that are more important than fear. There are some things that are more important than fear. And I thought this is exactly what we need. Because actually, if leaders are fearless, then they will not be ducking these challenges. They will feel able to be applying their virtues, being ethical, being brave, having conversations, all these things. And then, second exhibit, jolly old Bible, Romans, chapter 5, verses 3 to 5. More than that, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. And it occurred to me that all of these things people said they'd learned, none of these are fun things, are they? They're all about high-octane cock-ups when you were suddenly promoted and you made a terrible decision, or you went bouncing to shareholder meeting and they basically booed you off, or you failed to sack when you should have sacked, you let something fly when it shouldn't have done. A lot of this is really hard-won, ghastly experience. And what we'd done with it, by the way, is we'd baked it into a 2-day simulation where poor punters would come to Ashridge and have 2 days of hell, where we just made them do these things. We had actors, we had the whole thing, so it felt real enough that their bodies would think it was real. And we knew it worked because I had one guy came up to me and he'd had an issue with, women crying, men shouting, so he'd had both, lucky chap. And he'd in fact, when he'd been having the shouty man conversation, he'd ended up trying to have a fight with him, and we had to kind of separate them and go for a walk. And about 6 months later, I was phoning him up to say, how did it go, what have you learned about yourself as a leader since then? And he told me a story about being back at work, and he was setting off down the corridor, and he suddenly saw a colleague coming towards him who was clearly hopping mad about something. And he said, it was really interesting. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck going up, I could feel myself going red, I could feel my heart starting, and all of a sudden I had a sort of photograph in front of me of that actor man that I'd almost had a fight with. And in that moment I had time to think, I do not want that to happen again. And that allowed him to choose a different response. It's a bit like those of you who are fans of The Matrix, that bit of The Matrix where Neo sort of walks around the bullets, sort of bullet time. What we're trying to buy is time for leaders to be reflective about what choice they really want to make, rather than just falling into habits. And I think this is important because I think this is actually about character. And it is about the virtues and it's about the practices, because it's trying to get really specific about what would you need to occupy yourself in doing in the right sort of way in order to get the kinds of templates you need for this stuff to be effortless. So what we did is we did an experiment. We wired all these poor punters up to heart monitors for a 48-hour period so we could see what was happening while they were going through this simulation. And we had a hypothesis because of this idea of the amygdala and the neocortex that probably there was something that we could track through heart rate variability about stress. And we thought, furthermore, the thing about fight or flight actually, I don't know if you've ever really thought about it, but it's not really fight or flight, it's actually fight then flight. What tends to happen though is the fight can be extremely short-lived if you think it's game over and then you go straight to flight. But what we know happens in that moment, which is entirely facilitated by biology telling you that's the mode you need to be in, which is why a lot of us get trapped into that because there's too much cortisol in our system from artificial deadlines and bad sleep and dreadful food habits and a whole load of other things, let alone the stress of other people. What our body does is it uses all of that to use more of the brain for problem solving. So what happens when you're in that fight mode is your brain just starts going absolutely bananas, desperately trying to find you help. So it's a really brilliant mode to be in temporarily because it's where you are at your very, very strongest cerebrally. What then happens is if there's nothing in there, then your body will say, okay, it's game over. And then that starts shutting down so that you can prioritise physical strength and all of that to manage exit. And what we know is the trigger there is that if your brain's gone shopping and it doesn't feel resourced to cope, then it will tell you it's game over. And we know that this is actually not a very rational decision, because you'll have all read stories in the Daily Mail about hysterical strength when you have grannies lifting cars off toddlers. They shouldn't be able to do that. But in the moment they are resourced to cope because it's their grandchild and they're not going to be having them die on their watch. So we know that's entirely a psychological decision that your head makes. Am I resourced to cope? So actually you don't even need to be resourced to cope. You just need to think you might be. So the point about simulations, the point about practice, is it doesn't even need to be that real as long as it makes you think you have more options. And if you think you've got more options, then it allows your cortex, Dr. Oxbridge, brilliant filing man, to be in the ascendancy for a bit longer, which means you won't be so vulnerable to just habitual responses which may make you feel out of control and may not help you when you're trying to be ethical about things. So that made me think, well, how can we take all of this data we've got and turn it into something that people can use day to day? Because what we learned from analysing all of the heart rate monitoring evidence, we triangulated it against demographics and psychometrics and all that, just to figure out if there was particular personality preferences or styles that would be susceptible to this learning or not. And in fact, none of that was relevant. None of it was relevant. The only thing that's relevant, the only thing that was data that was relevant, was a direct correlation between increased heart rate and increased learning. And that was in the moment, in terms of reported learning, observed learning, trait state questionnaires, the whole thing. After a month, it was the same. After 3 months, it was the same. After 6 months, it's the same. And those of you who know about ROI on learning development, those of you who know about the forgetting curve, it's pretty phenomenal that anyone could even remember anything for 6 months, let alone leadership development, whatever that is. So there's something about memories that are acquired under pressure not only being more swiftly and deeply acquired, but having a better shelf life. And of course that's a no-brainer if you think about it, because when your body thinks this might be stuff that's going to help it survive in the future, it's going to prioritise it. So what we learned from that is that most learning development, which is about you sitting in your big chair making cerebral decisions, is also monitored through happy sheets, where at the end of it you do sort of 5 out of 5 and you say, I really love that. That doesn't tell you anything about learning. And in fact, probably if you hated it, that would be a better indication that you'd learned something, because you felt so uncomfortable, you'd be angry with people that were doing it. So the whole way we have been trying to develop leaders is probably wrong, because it is helpful, of course, to give people all kinds of articles, and I'm giving you links to them for goodness sake. But if you are really trying to make sure that under pressure leaders can consistently be their best self, then you have to pay attention to exactly what are we populating where. So this is where this comes in. Does anyone know what this is? Do pass it around and have a look. I was given it by my vicar in St Andrews. I sang in the choir there, and he gave it to me when I was confirmed because it was in the cupboard. And it's an apprentice piece, and that church in Fife was built by the Younger family, who are the big brewing family, because they were worried about the morals of the fisher folk in St Andrews, which you can see would be a problem. And she picked up a load of marble from all the trots around Italy, and the whole place is a rhapsody in marble. And this, they think, was an apprentice piece to show that one of the apprentices was capable of working with kind of big, expensive marble by doing something perfectly in miniature. I was teaching a gang from the Claw Leadership program, which is a cultural research program, and I sort of held this aloft and said, does anyone know what this is? And some bright spark at the front said, oh, it's a cadre font. So I can now tell you, because she is the curator of the Oxford Natural History Museum, that these are all over the world, actually. Those of you who know your marble will know that serpentine is only found in the UK in the Lizard Peninsula. In fact, the Lizard Peninsula is made out of serpentine. And the tradition was, if you wanted to work the serpentine, you would serve an apprentice down the Lizard Peninsula, and when you were ready to join the guild, you would have to evidence through an apprentice piece that you were ready to be admitted. And the apprentice piece was to be a copy of the Cadre font. So they're all over the world, these little miniature fonts. And in fact, the rector at Cadre still has one he uses for travelling baptisms, with a little lid. So it's really interesting, because I love it as a metaphor, because the idea about this templating is about thinking about experiences and practices in Alistair MacIntyre's phraseology as apprentice pieces. So you don't need to be a brilliant leader now. You just need to be able to do small things really, really beautifully and well, because then that will give you the ability to scale up. It will resource you to be able to do a wider range of things later. So when we're thinking about character, I think character is essentially the same thing. I think there has been an old-fashioned notion that character is something you're born with, or you get injected into you. But actually character is just like when you cut a log and you see all those rings of grain, and you see all those knobs and knocks and all those things. That is evidence of character, having got through all of that and learning how to behave when those things happen to you, such that you have a huge well of resource to deal with. So the problem we've got with ethics in leadership today is it's very reactive and it's very much about calibrating pros and cons. It's not about a focus on virtue, it's not about a focus on creating better people. So it means you are susceptible to business cases, which may or may not ultimately be helpful from day to day, and you are susceptible to pressure from outside. And I suppose where I'd like to end up, really, is an encouragement to you to be thinking, well, where am I feeling unresourced? If I was to be one of these people who was a blue-eyed person or a brown-eyed person, or asked to administer electric shocks, or asked to do something rather unpleasant by a boss, would I be able to not do that? Or would I sort of say I was only obeying orders? Because we've all got to deal with that dilemma in our everyday lives. And often we just kind of switch off a bit, we just sort of forget and go with the flow. If you're a person who has got a really good character, you don't, because you know it's not worth it. It's not worth it to you and your immortal soul. But you only get your character by just sheer bloody hard work of trying to figure out where are you not resourced and going then. Because the Milgram experiments, the thing that's devastating about those is not so much that everybody, pretty much, a massively high proportion, would have administered these shocks. It was that what was going on was a conflict of virtue. It wasn't that there was no virtue in it. It's that those people were so used to obeying authority, that was an easier muscle to flex than, I don't know, whether you call it humility or compassion or any of these sorts of virtues. So there are probably virtues, which I think Robert Parker would call eulogy virtues, which are the harder ones, which are the ones that McIntyre would particularly talk about. Most of us in our daily lives have many more opportunities to practice our CV virtues, about being fabulous in order to sort of get promoted and get on in our careers and professional lives. And actually I think a really interesting thing for you to think about going away from here and going away from these incredible 8 seminars, which sound as though they've been really fascinating, is to figure out where are the gaps in my character, where are there some virtues I haven't really had a chance to particularly practice, and are there ways I can curate my own development next by thinking about where in my diary is there an opportunity for an apprentice piece. It isn't about necessarily building something new, it's about looking at the next meeting and thinking, could I practice something there that would be beautiful in miniature, that would make me and other people know that I'm on the right track.